I missed the last bus home, but then an old, creaky bus pulled up out of nowhere. The driver smiled too wide and said, "We've been waiting for you." I should have known better than to stay out so late. My phone had died hours ago, leaving me without a way to call a ride. The streets were empty, the streetlights flickering ominously as I paced the sidewalk near the bus stop. The schedule posted there told me the last bus should have already come and gone, but I hoped against hope that maybe it was running late. It was almost midnight, and the city had taken on a strange, silent quality. No cars, no pedestrians, not even the faint hum of distant music from the bars. Just me, alone in the quiet. Then I heard it, a faint rumble in the distance. My heart leapt. A bus? At this hour? The noise grew louder, and soon I saw headlights piercing through the mist that had suddenly blanketed the street. The bus screeched to a stop in front of me. It looked ancient, the paint faded and peeling, the destination sign unreadable. The door hissed open, and the driver leaned out. He was pale, his eyes sunken, but what unsettled me most was his smile. It stretched too far across his face, showing teeth that seemed too sharp. "We've been waiting for you," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I hesitated. This bus wasn't on any schedule I'd ever seen, but the thought of walking home alone in the dark was even less appealing. I stepped on, and the door slammed shut behind me. The interior was dimly lit, the seats worn and tattered. There were only a handful of passengers, all sitting eerily still, their heads bowed. I made my way to the back, trying not to look too closely at anyone. Something about them felt off. As the bus lurched forward, I realized the route wasn't familiar. We weren't heading toward my neighborhood. Instead, we seemed to be moving farther and farther away from the city, the buildings giving way to endless dark woods. I tried to ask the driver where we were going, but he didn't respond. He just kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road, that unsettling grin never leaving his face. I turned to the passengers, hoping someone could explain, but they didn't react. It was as if they hadn't even heard me. That's when I noticed their skin grayish, almost translucent, and their clothes, which seemed outdated by decades. Panic set in. I decided I'd had enough and marched toward the front of the bus. "Let me off!" I shouted. The driver finally looked at me through the rearview mirror, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You can't get off." "Not yet." "Why not?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Because you got on," he replied, as if that explained everything. The other passengers slowly lifted their heads, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They were watching me now, their expressions blank but somehow menacing. I stumbled back to my seat, my mind racing. Was this some kind of sick prank? A nightmare I couldn't wake up from? The bus continued down the endless road, the outside world growing darker and stranger. The trees seemed to twist and writhe, their branches reaching toward the bus like grasping hands. Shadows danced along the windows, though there was no light source to cast them. And then the whispering started. At first it was faint, like a breeze through the trees. But soon it grew louder, more distinct. Voices, dozens of them, speaking in hushed tones I couldn't quite understand. The passengers began to move, turning to face me. Their mouths opened, but their lips didn't move in sync with the whispers. It was as if the voices were coming from somewhere else entirely. I clenched my fists, trying to convince myself this wasn't real. "Where are you taking me?" I shouted, my voice breaking. "To where you belong," the driver said without turning around. The whispers grew louder, the words finally becoming clear. They were calling my name. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted for the door, pounding on it, trying to force it open. The passengers rose from their seats, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets on strings. The driver laughed, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "You can't escape. You boarded willingly. Now, you'll ride with us forever." The bus began to change, the walls pulsating as if they were alive. The windows went dark, and the air grew thick and suffocating. I turned to face the passengers, but they weren't human anymore. Their faces had melted into grotesque masks, their glowing eyes fixed on me. I screamed as they closed in, their cold hands grabbing at me, pulling me down into the darkness. I woke up in a cold sweat, lying on the sidewalk near the bus stop. The streetlights flickered above me, and the mist had cleared. For a moment, I thought it had all been a horrible dream. But when I stood up, I noticed a faint imprint of a bus ticket in my palm. The date on it was from 20 years ago. And then I heard it again, the rumble of an approaching bus. I froze. My legs refused to move as the sound grew louder, and the headlights pierced through the night once more. The same old, creaky bus rolled up, screeching to a stop in front of me. The door hissed open, and there he was again, the driver, smiling that too-wide grin. "Did you enjoy the trial run?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. I stumbled back, shaking my head. No, I'm not getting on again." The driver leaned out, his eyes narrowing. "You don't have a choice. You're marked now." He pointed to my palm, and I looked down. The imprint of the ticket wasn't just faint anymore. It was glowing, burning into my skin like a brand. I yelped and tried to rub it off, but it wouldn't budge. "You're ours," the driver said, his grin widening even further. "You belong to the midnight bus now. The only question is, will you come willingly, or shall we fetch you?" The passengers inside the bus leaned toward the windows, their glowing eyes fixed on me. Their faces were distorted, stretched in impossible ways, and their mouths moved silently, as if chanting some spell I couldn't hear. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted through the empty streets. I could still hear the rumble of the bus behind me, always just out of sight, but never far enough away. The city around me seemed to twist and change. Streets I had walked 1,000 times before now led to unfamiliar places. Buildings loomed over me, their windows dark and lifeless. The mist returned, swirling around my feet and making it impossible to see more than a few steps ahead. I ducked into an alley, pressing myself against the wall and trying to catch my breath. The rumble of the bus faded, and for a moment, I thought I might be safe. Then I heard the whispering again. It was closer this time, louder, and it seemed to be coming from all around me. The shadows in the alley began to move, stretching and shifting until they formed the outline of a bus. The door materialized right in front of me, hissing open to reveal the driver. "You can't run," he said, his voice low and menacing. "The midnight bus always collects its passengers." I backed away, shaking my head. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't." "You got on," he interrupted, stepping out of the bus. He was taller than I remembered, his body unnaturally thin, his limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. "And now, you must ride." The shadows in the alley came to life, wrapping around me like tendrils. I screamed and fought, but they were too strong. They pulled me toward the bus, toward the waiting passengers with their glowing eyes and grotesque smiles. I was dragged up the steps, the door slamming shut behind me. The driver returned to his seat, his laugh echoing through the bus as it began to move. The journey felt endless. The world outside the windows was no longer the city I knew, but a twisted landscape of darkness and chaos. The passengers whispered constantly, their voices filling my head with thoughts that weren't my own. I don't know how long I was on that bus. Hours, days, maybe even years. Time didn't seem to exist there. Eventually, the bus came to a stop and the door opened. "We've reached your destination," the driver said, his grin as unsettling as ever. I stepped off the bus, my legs trembling beneath me. I found myself standing on an empty street, the city eerily quiet. The bus rumbled away, disappearing into the mist, and I was left alone. For a moment, I thought it was over, but then I realized something was wrong. The streetlights flickered unnaturally, and the shadows seemed to watch me. I walked to the nearest shop window, hoping to find some sense of normalcy, but when I saw my reflection, I froze. My eyes were glowing. Now, every night at midnight, I hear the rumble of the bus outside my window. It waits for me, its door open, the driver smiling. And every night I get on. I'm not a passenger anymore. I'm part of the midnight bus.